Human history tells a simple story. It says that for most of Earth's existence, nothing intelligent walked its surface. That life struggled, adapted, evolved slowly and blindly until very recently modern humans emerged. According to this story, intelligence bloomed once, technology followed once, and civilization appeared suddenly as if from nowhere around 6,000 years ago. It is a comforting story, a neat story, and possibly an incomplete one. Because when we step back and look at the deeper timeline of Earth, not centuries or millennia, but millions and billions of years, the story begins to feel strangely compressed. Humanity's entire recorded history occupies less than a blink of geological time. And yet within that blink we find monuments that defy expectations, artifacts that seem out of place, and knowledge that appears too advanced for its supposed age. Tonight we begin with a question that quietly unsettles everything we think we know. What if humans were not the first advanced species on Earth, not aliens, not visitors from the stars, but an intelligence that arose here on this planet long before us? An intelligence whose traces were erased by time, catastrophe, and the restless surface of a changing world. To explore this possibility, we must leave behind assumptions, certainty, and the comfort of established timelines. We must listen carefully to the earth itself, to stone, to water, to silence, and ask whether the past is as empty as we believe. This is not a story of proof, it is a story of possibility, and it begins far earlier than written history. Long before cities, before farming, before the first word was carved into clay, the earth was already ancient. By the time modern humans appeared, our planet was more than 4 billion years old. Continents had drifted apart and collided again. Entire oceans had formed and vanished. Species had risen, flourished, and disappeared, leaving no witnesses behind. 5 times life on Earth nearly ended altogether. Asteroid impacts, volcanic winters, runaway climate shifts, global floods, ice ages that buried entire landscapes beneath kilometers of ice. Each of these events did more than destroy life. They erased evidence. They reset the surface of the planet, grinding mountains into dust and pushing coastlines far from where they once stood. Now consider this carefully. If an advanced civilization existed before our own, not necessarily industrial, not necessarily technological in the modern sense, how much evidence would truly remain after tens of thousands of years? After floods, ice, earthquakes, and rising seas? The uncomfortable answer is very little. Stone might endure, geometry might endure, location might endure, but metals rust, wood rots, cities sink, knowledge dies with its keepers. And yet, when archaeologists dig into the deep past, they sometimes find things that do not quite belong. Let us begin with one of the most unsettling facts in archaeology. According to conventional history, humans first developed agriculture, then settled into permanent communities, and only later built monumental structures. The logic seems obvious. Farming creates surplus, surplus creates specialization, and specialization allows for architecture, art, and religion. But in one place on Earth, this sequence appears to be reversed. Here, monumental stone structures appear first, long before farming, long before cities, long before metal tools. Massive carved pillars rise from the ground, arranged with deliberate geometry, aligned with celestial events, and decorated with intricate reliefs of animals that no longer exist in the region. Who built them? The builders were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, people who moved constantly, who carried few possessions, who left little behind. And yet the stones weigh many tons. They were quarried, shaped, transported, and erected with precision. This alone raises a troubling possibility. Perhaps these people were not as simple as we imagine, or perhaps they inherited knowledge from somewhere else, from someone else. When faced with anomalies like this, history often responds by shrinking them, labeling them as isolated miracles, cultural accidents, or misunderstood achievements. But when such anomalies appear again and again, scattered across the globe, a pattern begins to form. Across continents, we find ancient stonework that displays precision beyond what is expected for its era. Blocks fitted together so tightly that even a blade of grass cannot pass between them. Walls that have survived earthquakes that destroyed everything built after them. Foundations so massive that later civilizations built on top of them, as if unwilling or unable to replicate the original work. Why does advanced stonework appear at the very beginning of civilization rather than at its peak? Why do later cultures often seem to inherit, reuse, or repair structures they did not fully understand? And why do so many ancient myths speak of a time before time? A golden age when knowledge was greater, when the world was different, when the gods walked among humans or taught them the arts of civilization. These stories appear independently in cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years. They describe floods that ended earlier ages. They describe survivors who passed down fragments of knowledge to rebuild the world anew. Myth, of course, is not history, but myth often grows where memory fades. Let us pause here and reflect on something essential. If an advanced intelligence existed before modern humans, it may not have resembled us at all. We imagine technology as machines, electricity, metal, and speed. But advancement does not require factories or digital networks. It may take forms we no longer recognize: astronomical knowledge, mathematics encoded in stone, architecture aligned with planetary cycles, an understanding of Earth's rhythms, climate, water, and sky. A civilization like this would leave behind monuments, not machines. It would build to last, not to evolve. And it would choose stone. Stone is patient. Stone remembers, yet even stone can be swallowed by time. During the last ice age, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. Vast coastal plains existed where oceans now lie. Rivers flowed through landscapes that are currently submerged. If an early civilization favored coastlines, as modern civilizations do, most of its cities would now rest beneath the sea, covered by sand, eroded by currents, dismissed as natural formations. And this leads us to a haunting realization. We have explored the surface of Mars more thoroughly than the depths of our own oceans. Less than a fraction of the seafloor has been mapped in high resolution. Beneath those waters may lie harbors, roads, walls, and foundations, silent, unseen, and unexplored. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, it is simply absence. As we move deeper into this subject, another category of anomaly begins to emerge: objects that appear far too complex, far too precise, or far too advanced for the period in which they were found. Devices with moving parts, gear systems, precise ratios, mathematical sophistication embedded in physical form. These artifacts are rare, fragmented, and often dismissed as one-off inventions. But rarity does not imply impossibility. It implies survival against impossible odds. Imagine a library burned, leaving behind a single page. Would we judge the intelligence of its creators based on that page alone? Now imagine that the library was not burned once, but 5 times by ice, fire, water, and time itself. What would remain? What fragments would we misinterpret? What would we never find at all? As we continue this journey, we must confront a difficult truth. Modern humans may not be the culmination of Earth's intelligence, but merely its latest expression. A chapter, not the book. When we last paused, we stood at the edge of a realization that feels both thrilling and unsettling, that Earth has had enough time for intelligence to arise more than once, and that the absence of clear evidence may say more about catastrophe and erosion than about impossibility. Now we go deeper. To do so, we must confront a quiet assumption that underlies almost all of modern history, the belief that progress is linear, that intelligence moves forward in a straight line, that knowledge accumulates, never truly disappearing, only transforming. But nature does not move in straight lines. Nature cycles, forests burn and regrow, oceans rise and retreat, species dominate and vanish, and intelligence, bound to nature, may follow the same rhythm. The idea that a civilization could rise, peak, and collapse completely, leaving only scattered traces, feels unthinkable to us because we stand inside our own moment of technological confidence. We imagine satellites, servers, digital records, and global connectivity as permanent, yet permanence is an illusion. Even today, our cities depend on constant maintenance. Our infrastructure erodes without attention. Our digital knowledge stored on fragile media requires electricity and compatibility to survive. A single global catastrophe, a prolonged climate collapse, a major impact, or a chain of natural disasters could reduce our world to fragments within centuries, and centuries are nothing to the Earth. Now imagine a culture that existed tens of thousands of years ago, not necessarily industrial, not powered by fossil fuels or electricity. A culture whose knowledge was encoded in ritual, geometry, oral tradition, and stone. Such a culture would leave behind no plastic, no silicon, no power grids, only what could endure: stone, earthworks, patterns, and this is where the story becomes more uncomfortable. Across the world, from high mountains to desert plains, from jungles to frozen plateaus, ancient structures appear that share strange similarities. They are massive, they are precise, they are often aligned with the sky. And they frequently appear at the very beginning of a region's known civilization, as if dropped into history fully formed. In many cases, later cultures repair them, build upon them, or surround them with newer constructions. This layering creates the illusion that all of it belongs to the same era, but when archaeologists look closely, they find something unexpected. The oldest layers are often the most advanced. The stonework is tighter, the blocks are larger, the foundations are deeper. And the techniques used to shape and move these stones remain unclear. We are told that ancient people lacked wheels, metal tools, or advanced mathematics. And yet they moved stones weighing tens, sometimes hundreds of tons across long distances and uneven terrain. They fitted them together with tolerances that challenge even modern engineering. When asked how this was done, explanations tend to rely on theoretical reconstructions: ropes, logs, manpower, and time. But these explanations often rely on assumptions rather than evidence, and sometimes they quietly fail. Consider this: if simple methods were sufficient, why did later civilizations abandon them? Why do we see a decline in megalithic construction after a certain point in history rather than a gradual improvement? Why does architecture become smaller, less precise, and more fragile? Progress should refine, not retreat, unless something was lost. This brings us to a delicate but essential idea: that knowledge itself can go extinct. Not all knowledge is written down, not all writing survives, not all survivors remember everything. Oral traditions passed down through generations can preserve information with remarkable accuracy, but only as long as the chain remains unbroken. When catastrophe strikes, that chain can snap. Flood myths appear on every inhabited continent. Stories of a world-ending deluge, of a time when waters rose and civilization was nearly erased. While these myths differ in detail, they share a striking core narrative: destruction, survival, and renewal. These stories are often dismissed as metaphor, but metaphors do not drown cities. Sea levels did rise dramatically at the end of the last ice age. Coastlines flooded, rivers changed course, entire regions vanished beneath the ocean. Human populations were displaced, fragmented, and forced to adapt quickly. If there had been centers of knowledge, coastal hubs, trade routes, ceremonial sites, they would now be submerged, and underwater archaeology is still in its infancy. We search deserts and jungles with satellites and LiDAR. We excavate land with care and precision. But the oceans, vast, deep, and relentless, remain largely unexplored. What lies beneath them is unknown, not because it is unimportant, but because it is difficult. Now let us turn to something even more unsettling: objects. Occasionally, artifacts emerge that do not fit comfortably into the timelines assigned to them. Devices with moving parts, evidence of precision machining, mathematical complexity embedded in physical form. These objects are often isolated, fragmentary, and surrounded by debate. Their very existence challenges assumptions, so they are labeled anomalies, exceptions that prove the rule. But exceptions accumulate, and when they do, the rule begins to bend. The question is not whether ancient people were intelligent. That is beyond dispute. The question is whether their intelligence could have reached levels we no longer expect, levels that do not align with our story of gradual progress. Imagine a civilization that prioritized understanding the cosmos over building empires, that tracked celestial cycles with extreme accuracy, that encoded astronomical knowledge into architecture and myth. Such a civilization would leave behind alignments rather than libraries, stones placed to mark solstices, equinoxes, eclipses, structures that functioned as calendars, observatories, and teaching tools. And this is precisely what we find. Again and again, ancient structures align with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. They track long cycles, cycles that require generations of observation to understand. In some cases, these cycles extend beyond a human lifetime. Why would supposedly primitive cultures invest so much effort into tracking time on a cosmic scale? Why would they care, unless they inherited this knowledge, unless they were preserving something older? At this point, a familiar objection arises. If an advanced civilization existed before humans, where are the remains of its population? Where are the skeletons, the genetic traces? The answer may be simpler and more unsettling than it appears. Advanced does not mean numerous. A civilization does not need billions of individuals to shape the world. It does not need global dominance to leave lasting marks. A small, concentrated population with specialized knowledge could influence vast regions through ideas rather than conquest, and genetic traces fade. Over tens of thousands of years, populations mix, migrate, and change. Bones dissolve, DNA degrades. What survives is not the individual, but the influence. Ideas outlive bodies, and ideas leave echoes. These echoes appear in sudden leaps of knowledge, in myths that describe teachers from the past, in stories of culture bringers, figures who arrive after catastrophe to restore agriculture, astronomy, and law. Such figures appear worldwide, bearing different names but similar roles. They are not conquerors, they are instructors. And once their task is complete, they disappear. Mythology calls them gods, but perhaps they were simply survivors. Now consider another possibility, one that challenges our assumptions even further. What if the intelligence that came before us was not human as we understand it? Evolution does not move with intent, it experiments endlessly. Intelligence has arisen multiple times in different forms: birds, mammals, cephalopods. There's no reason to assume that complex cognition must look like us. A non-human intelligence could have existed millions of years ago, reached a level of environmental mastery, and then vanished, leaving behind traces that we misinterpret or fail to recognize. We assume tools must look like tools, but what if they looked like landscapes, earthworks, altered geology, subtle changes mistaken for natural formations? Our criteria for advanced may be too narrow. We search for metal, machines, and cities, but intelligence might express itself through harmony with natural systems rather than domination of them, through long-term planning rather than rapid expansion, through knowledge rather than accumulation. Such a civilization would leave a light footprint, and light footprints are easily erased. As we move forward, it becomes clear that the greatest barrier to understanding Earth's deep past is not lack of evidence, but expectation. We expect intelligence to announce itself loudly, to leave behind unmistakable signatures, but the Earth is old and the Earth forgets. Mountain ranges erode into plains, plains sink beneath oceans, oceans dry and become deserts. The surface of this planet is not a museum. It is a living system, constantly recycling itself. So when we ask whether humans were the first advanced species, we must also ask a deeper question. Would we even recognize the evidence if we found it? Would we accept it, or would we explain it away, reshape it, and fit it neatly into the story we already believe? There's a moment when studying the deep past where curiosity quietly turns into discomfort. It happens when the questions stop being abstract and begin to point directly at our assumptions, when the anomalies are no longer isolated curiosities but form a loose constellation, one that suggests intention, memory, and loss. In this part, we move closer to those anomalies. Not to declare what they are, but to observe how they behave when placed beside one another. Because patterns matter, and patterns are rarely accidental. Let us begin with stone. Stone is the oldest witness we have. It does not speak, it does not explain itself, and it does not adapt to interpretation. It simply remains weathered but persistent, carrying the imprint of decisions made long ago. Across the world, ancient stone structures display characteristics that seem strangely deliberate. They are often built on bedrock. They favor elevated locations or specific geographic nodes. They align with celestial events that repeat with astonishing precision. And perhaps most curiously, they are frequently constructed in places that later civilizations considered sacred. Why would sanctity persist when meaning is lost? Why would a site remain revered long after its original purpose was forgotten? One explanation is cultural continuity. Another is inheritance. When people do not know why something is important, they often preserve it anyway out of respect, fear, or tradition. Meaning fades, but ritual remains. This phenomenon appears repeatedly in archaeology. Structures whose function is unclear are repurposed. Platforms become temples, foundations become shrines. Old stones are wrapped in new stories, but the stones themselves do not change. When we examine the oldest layers of these sites, we often find engineering that seems out of place. Massive blocks set with precision, sometimes forming walls or terraces that are far more robust than anything built later. Above them, lighter materials appear, smaller stones, less careful fitting. This inversion, where the deepest layers are the most refined, raises difficult questions. It suggests not a gradual improvement of technique, but a decline, and decline implies loss. Now consider how knowledge is usually transmitted. In stable civilizations, techniques are refined over time. Skills are taught, standardized, improved, tools evolve, mistakes are corrected, progress leaves a trail. But when knowledge is inherited without full understanding, it becomes ritualized. Techniques are copied without knowing why they work. Eventually, they fail or are abandoned entirely. This may explain why later builders attempted to replicate ancient stonework and failed. They imitated surface features, not underlying principles. They used smaller stones, more mortar, different geometry. They remembered the form but not the method. What kind of knowledge could be lost so completely? Possibly a way of working with stone that relied not on brute force but on subtle understanding of leverage, vibration, resonance, or material properties we do not fully appreciate today, or perhaps techniques that depended on environmental conditions that no longer exist. The Earth itself has changed. Gravity has not shifted significantly, but climate has. Sea levels, atmospheric composition, vegetation, and animal populations have all transformed dramatically. A method feasible in one era may be impractical in another. Now let us turn our attention away from land and toward water. The oceans cover more than 70% of the planet's surface. They are not empty voids. They are dynamic, layered systems that preserve and destroy simultaneously. Currents bury some things while revealing others. Sand protects, salt corrodes. We know with certainty that sea levels rose rapidly at the end of the last ice age. In some regions, shorelines moved kilometers inland within a few human generations. Entire ecosystems were drowned. If humans or any intelligent species had built along those ancient coasts, their settlements would now be underwater. And yet we tend to imagine the past as landlocked. We dig where we can walk. Underwater archaeology is expensive, slow, and technologically demanding. As a result, vast areas of potential history remain unexplored, not because they lack importance, but because they lie beyond easy reach. Occasionally, divers encounter formations beneath the sea that appear geometric. Terraces, straight edges, step-like structures. These are often dismissed as natural formations shaped by erosion, and many are, but not all. The difficulty lies in distinguishing intention from coincidence. Nature can create astonishing patterns. But nature does not favor right angles, symmetry, or repeated proportions without cause. When underwater structures display consistent geometry, alignment, and scale, the question must be asked, not answered, but asked whether they are entirely natural. As with land-based anomalies, these questions are often set aside, not because they are absurd, but because they complicate the narrative. And narratives are powerful. They shape funding, they shape careers, they shape what questions are considered reasonable. This does not imply deception, it implies structure. Human knowledge is built within frameworks, and frameworks resist disruption. Now let us consider another form of evidence, one that is both subtle and pervasive. Timekeeping. Tracking time is not trivial. It requires patience, consistency, and abstraction. To recognize cycles, one must observe for years. To understand longer cycles, one must record across generations. And yet ancient cultures tracked time with remarkable sophistication. They identified solstices and equinoxes. They tracked lunar cycles. They marked planetary movements. In some cases, they encoded knowledge of long astronomical periods that take tens of thousands of years to complete. This knowledge appears early, too early. It emerges suddenly without obvious precursors. Calendars appear fully formed. Alignments are precise. Errors are minimal. How did this happen? One possibility is prolonged observation over many generations. Another is inheritance, knowledge passed down from an earlier source. It is worth noting that astronomy is one of the few sciences that leaves clear physical traces. Alignments cannot be faked easily. They either work or they do not. When a structure aligns with a celestial event that occurs once every 19 years or once every 72 years, it implies careful planning and deep understanding. Such planning requires more than curiosity. It requires purpose. Why would early cultures invest such effort into tracking the sky? The answer may lie in survival. In a world shaped by natural cycles, ice ages, floods, droughts, understanding time is power. Predicting change allows preparation. It allows memory to extend beyond individual lifespans. If a civilization experienced catastrophe, especially one driven by climate or cosmic events, it might place extraordinary importance on preserving temporal knowledge, on remembering when the world changes. Stone calendars do not burn, they do not rot, they do not forget. Now let us turn to the most uncomfortable possibility of all, that the evidence we seek does not announce itself because we are not looking for the right things. We search for roads, cities, and tools because that is what we would build, but intelligence does not mandate similarity. A different species or even a different human culture might prioritize stability over expansion, knowledge over accumulation. Such a civilization might alter landscapes subtly rather than dramatically. It might engineer ecosystems instead of cities. It might encode information in myth, ritual, and monument rather than text. From our perspective, this would look like absence, but absence can be misleading. Consider how much of our own civilization would survive without maintenance. Skyscrapers collapse, roads crack, digital records vanish. Within a few thousand years, much of what defines us would be gone. What would remain? Stone monuments, foundations, altered terrain, artifacts buried by chance, and interpretations would vary. Future beings might wonder whether we were truly advanced or merely noisy. Now imagine that this process has already occurred. Imagine that what we call prehistory is not a beginning but a recovery. A long, slow rebuilding after collapse, small populations scattered across a damaged world, knowledge reduced to fragments, skills remembered imperfectly, stories distorted with time. In such a world, progress would not be smooth, it would stutter, leap forward, fall back, forget, rediscover. And this is exactly what the archaeological record suggests. Periods of sudden advancement, periods of stagnation, technologies appearing, disappearing, reappearing, not a straight line, a wave. As we prepare to move into the next part of this exploration, we must confront a final, humbling thought. History may not be a story of ascent, it may be a story of repetition. Civilizations rising when conditions allow, collapsing when conditions change, leaving behind whispers for those who come after. If this is true, then the question is no longer whether humans were the first advanced species. The question becomes far more personal. If others came before us, what happened to them, and what does that mean for us? To understand whether intelligence could have existed before us, we must confront the most difficult question of all, not how a civilization might rise, but how completely it could fall. Because collapse is not rare, collapse is the rule. The Earth is not a stable platform upon which progress gently accumulates. It is an active system, restless and unforgiving. Beneath every city lies shifting stone. Above every culture hangs an unpredictable sky. And across time, the planet has demonstrated again and again that dominance is temporary. The deeper we look into geological history, the clearer this truth becomes. Earth has experienced at least 5 mass extinctions. Events so severe that the majority of life vanished in a geological instant. These were not subtle transitions. They were violent resets, moments when the rules changed abruptly, when entire branches of evolution were severed. And yet life returned, it always does. This resilience can mislead us into thinking that intelligence, once achieved, is inevitable and enduring. But intelligence is fragile. It depends on continuity, on memory, cooperation, and stability. When those are disrupted, intelligence does not merely slow, it fractures. Consider how easily our own world could unravel. Our cities depend on supply chains that stretch across continents. Our food systems rely on predictable seasons. Our technology depends on electricity, rare materials, and specialized knowledge concentrated in small groups. Remove any one of these pillars for long enough and complexity collapses into survival. Now imagine a global catastrophe. Not a single explosion, but a cascade. A sudden climate shift, a prolonged drought or freeze, volcanic eruptions darkening the sky, crop failures, mass migration, conflict over resources. In such a scenario, the preservation of knowledge becomes secondary to survival. Specialists become generalists. Maintenance gives way to improvisation. Skills that cannot feed, shelter, or protect are abandoned. And once knowledge is no longer practiced, it begins to fade. This is how civilizations forget themselves. The archaeological record preserves many examples of partial collapse. Cultures that once built extensively, traded widely, and governed complex territories suddenly contracted. Cities were abandoned, writing disappeared, technology regressed. These collapses did not require extinction. They required disruption. Now imagine collapse on a planetary scale. The last ice age did not arrive gently. It reshaped the world over thousands of years, punctuated by sudden, violent climatic shifts. Temperatures fluctuated rapidly. Ice sheets advanced and retreated. Sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing vast tracts of land only to reclaim them later. Human populations survived this era but barely. They fragmented into small groups, adapting to harsh and unpredictable conditions. Long-term projects became impossible. Monumental construction, if it existed, would have required planning beyond the reach of daily survival. If an advanced civilization existed before or during this period, it would have faced relentless pressure. And pressure breaks systems. Ice grinds mountains into dust. Glaciers erase landscapes. Floods bury cities beneath sediment. Earthquakes shatter foundations. Time completes the work. After enough cycles of destruction and rebuilding, only the most resilient traces remain, and even those are ambiguous. This is why geology is as important as archaeology. Stone remembers events that memory cannot. Layers of sediment tell stories of floods. Ash layers mark volcanic winters. Craters record impacts from the sky. Magnetic reversals imprint themselves in rock. These are not myths, they are physical records, and they tell us that the Earth has not been kind to continuity. One event in particular deserves attention, a period near the end of the last ice age known for sudden and dramatic change. Temperatures dropped rapidly. Ecosystems collapsed. Large animals vanished. Human cultures reorganized almost overnight. The cause is still debated. Some suggest cosmic impacts. Others propose massive meltwater floods disrupting ocean currents. Still others point to volcanic activity. What matters is not the cause, but the effect. This was a shock to the system. And shocks leave survivors, not records. Now consider the psychological impact of such events. If a civilization experienced repeated near extinction, its worldview would change. Long-term ambition would give way to caution. Expansion would feel reckless. Preservation would become sacred. Knowledge would be encoded in durable forms, stories, rituals, symbols, monuments. Anything fragile would be abandoned. Perhaps this explains why so many ancient traditions emphasize cycles rather than progress. Ages rise and fall. Worlds begin and end. Time is not a line but a wheel. These are not the metaphors of optimists. They are the metaphors of survivors. Now let us imagine a scenario. A pre-human or early human civilization arises during a period of relative stability. It develops sophisticated understanding of astronomy, climate, and Earth systems. It builds monuments to preserve knowledge across generations. It thrives for thousands of years. Then conditions change, sea levels rise. The climate shifts, resources disappear, the civilization contracts, cities are abandoned, coastal centers drown, knowledge is fragmented, survivors scatter inland, carrying only what they can remember. Over time, memory becomes myth, stories of a lost age, teachers from before the flood, a time when the world was ordered differently. To later cultures, these stories sound symbolic, but symbolism often grows from experience. Now consider how later humans would interpret the remnants of this civilization. They would find ruins without context, tools without instruction, alignments without explanation. They would reuse what they could and revere what they could not understand. Over generations, the original purpose would be forgotten. The structures would become sacred because they were incomprehensible, and incomprehensible things inspire awe. This may explain why so many ancient sites are surrounded by legends of gods, giants, or supernatural builders. When people cannot imagine humans achieving something, they attribute it to forces beyond themselves. This is not foolishness. It is humility in the face of mystery, but humility can also obscure truth. Now let us turn inward. Why is the idea of a pre-human advanced civilization so uncomfortable? It is not because it threatens science. Science thrives on revision. It is not because it threatens evidence. Evidence invites scrutiny. It is uncomfortable because it threatens uniqueness. We like to believe we are the first, the pinnacle, the moment when the universe became aware of itself. If intelligence has risen before and failed, then our story becomes less heroic and more cautionary. It suggests that intelligence is not destiny. It suggests that progress does not guarantee survival. And it suggests that we may be repeating patterns rather than escaping them. This perspective reframes ancient anomalies. They are no longer curiosities. They become warnings. Stone monuments aligned with the sky may not be celebrations of power, but reminders of vulnerability. Calendars may not mark festivals, but cycles of catastrophe. Myths of floods may not be allegory, but memory. In this light, the past becomes less distant, it becomes familiar. We too are tracking climate. We too are watching the sky. We too are recording data for futures we may not see. And like those before us, we assume continuity. But continuity is never guaranteed. As we prepare to move forward, we must shift our focus from what was built to what was remembered. Memory is the final refuge of lost civilizations. When physical evidence fades, memory becomes the final archive. Not memory as we understand it today, written records, dates, and names, but memory carried through story, symbol, and repetition. Memory reshaped by time, yet stubbornly persistent. Memory that survives not because it is precise, but because it is meaningful. This is where myth enters the discussion. Modern thinking often places myth and history at opposite ends of a spectrum, one imagined, the other factual. But this division is relatively recent. For most of human existence, myth was not entertainment, it was instruction. It encoded knowledge about the world, about danger, about survival, and about the past. When a civilization loses its ability to record events directly, it does not stop remembering. It changes how it remembers. Stories become vessels, and when we compare those vessels across cultures, something extraordinary appears. Separated by oceans, languages, and millennia, human societies tell remarkably similar stories about the distant past. They speak of earlier ages, often more advanced, more harmonious, or more powerful than the present. They speak of catastrophic endings, floods, fire from the sky, darkness, ice. They speak of a few survivors who carry knowledge forward into a diminished world. These themes are not rare, they are nearly universal. This alone does not prove anything. Humans share psychology. We fear destruction. We imagine origins. But when the details align, when the structure of the stories mirrors geological reality, the boundary between myth and memory begins to blur. Flood myths, in particular, demand attention. They appear in ancient Mesopotamia, South Asia, East Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Oceania. They describe rising waters that erase civilizations. They describe warnings ignored. They describe vessels, mountains, or refuges. They describe a rebirth of humanity afterward. It is tempting to explain these as local river floods exaggerated over time, but some details resist that simplification. Many of these stories describe global change, not local disaster. They speak of altered skies, new stars, shortened lifespans, and a world that never fully returns to what it was before. These are not the aftereffects of a seasonal flood. They are the echoes of profound transformation. Now consider how such stories would emerge if a civilization experienced large-scale sea level rise. Coastal cities drowned, lowlands vanished, populations were forced inland, carrying fragmented memories of places that no longer existed. To later generations, those places would sound mythical, cities beneath the sea, a world before the waters rose, ancestors who lived differently. The sea does not return what it takes. Now let us examine another recurring motif, the idea of teachers from the past. Many ancient cultures describe figures who arrive after catastrophe to restore order. They teach agriculture, astronomy, law, and construction. They bring calendars, measurement systems, and moral codes. They are often depicted as outsiders, arriving from the sea, the sky, or distant lands. Crucially, they do not rule forever. They teach. Then they leave. This is a strange role for gods, but a familiar role for survivors. If fragments of an earlier civilization endured, it is not unreasonable to imagine that some individuals carried knowledge into the aftermath. These individuals would appear extraordinary to people struggling to rebuild. Their understanding of seasons, crops, and stars would feel supernatural. Over generations, memory would elevate them beyond humanity. This process is not hypothetical. It happens even now. Historical figures become legends, achievements grow, motives simplify, complexity fades. What remains is archetype, teacher, lawgiver, culture bringer. Now consider another layer of myth, ages of the world. Many traditions divide history into distinct eras. Golden ages followed by silver, bronze, and iron. Ages of harmony replaced by ages of struggle. Cycles that repeat, not progress. These stories imply degeneration rather than advancement. This runs counter to modern expectations. But degeneration makes sense in a world shaped by catastrophe. If each cycle ends in collapse, then each new beginning starts from less than before. Knowledge is rebuilt, but not fully recovered. Skills return unevenly. Some insights are lost forever. Progress becomes uneven. This idea aligns uncomfortably well with the archaeological record. We do not see a smooth ascent. We see starts and stops, sudden appearances of sophistication, long plateaus, abrupt disappearances, and we see something else. Silence. There are gaps in human history where little evidence survives. Periods that should be rich in artifacts but are not. Times when populations seem to thin, scatter, or vanish. These gaps are often attributed to lack of excavation or preservation. But what if they represent something else? What if they mark intervals of collapse so severe that continuity was broken entirely? Now let us consider memory not as story but as instinct. Humans have deep-seated anxieties that are difficult to trace to personal experience. Fear of darkness, fear of open water, fear of sudden environmental change. These fears may be evolutionary, but they may also be cultural. Trauma leaves traces. If humanity inherited memory not just genetically but culturally, passed through story and ritual, then ancient catastrophes could still shape modern behavior. This might explain why early societies invested so much effort into appeasing nature, why they tracked the sky obsessively, why they treated floods, eclipses, and comets with reverence and fear. These were not curiosities, they were reminders. Now let us return to the central question, but approach it differently. Instead of asking whether humans were the first advanced species, ask this: what if intelligence is not rare but fragile? What if the universe does not struggle to produce intelligence but struggles to keep it? On Earth, intelligence emerged at least once in the form of modern humans, but evolution had billions of years to experiment before that. There is no law that prevents earlier forms of complex cognition from arising, flourishing briefly, and vanishing. The fossil record is incomplete. Soft tissue rarely preserves, bones erode. Entire species can disappear without leaving clear traces, and intelligence does not fossilize. We infer intelligence indirectly through tools, structures, and modification of the environment. If those modifications were subtle, biodegradable, or later erased, the evidence would be nearly invisible. This does not require science fiction. It requires humility. Now consider how this reframes our understanding of ourselves. We are not the first, then we are not exceptional by default. Our technologies, our cities, our ambitions are not guarantees. They are experiments, ones that may or may not endure. This perspective does not diminish humanity. It contextualizes it. It invites responsibility rather than pride. Ancient monuments may not be triumphs. They may be warnings etched in stone. Calendars tracking long cycles may not celebrate eternity. They may mark danger. Myths of floods may not entertain. They may caution. In this light, the past becomes a mirror, and what it reflects is not comfort but consequence. As we prepare to move forward, one final question emerges. If earlier intelligences existed, and if they left messages rather than machines, would we know how to read them, or would we dismiss them as coincidence, myth, or misunderstanding? At some point, every exploration of the deep past encounters an invisible boundary, not a lack of evidence, but a limit of interpretation. It is here quietly, almost imperceptibly, that the greatest obstacle to understanding emerges. Not erosion, not catastrophe, not time, but framework. Every civilization views the past through the lens of its present. Every question we ask is shaped by what we already believe to be possible. This is not a flaw unique to modern science. It is a condition of being human. We see what we expect to see. We measure what we know how to measure. We dismiss what does not fit. And so when we encounter anomalies, structures, artifacts, patterns that resist easy explanation, we tend to fold them back into familiar narratives rather than expand the narrative itself. This is not deception, it is preservation. Frameworks keep knowledge stable, they prevent chaos, they allow cumulative understanding, but they also create blind spots, and blind spots are where the most unsettling ideas hide. Consider how the concept of civilization is defined: cities, writing, agriculture, hierarchy, surplus, monumental architecture. These markers are useful, but they are not universal. They reflect a particular path, our path. If intelligence followed a different trajectory in the past, we may not recognize it as civilization at all. We might call it primitive, or symbolic, or ritualistic, or natural. We might miss it entirely. Now consider archaeology itself. Archaeology is an extraordinary discipline, but it is constrained by survival bias. We study what remains, not what existed. We excavate what endured, not what thrived. Materials that decay, wood, fiber, skin, organic composites, rarely survive long spans of time. Entire technological systems could vanish without a trace if they relied on such materials. Even stone does not guarantee clarity. Stone tools are ubiquitous because stone lasts, but stone tools do not necessarily reflect the full technological spectrum of a culture. They may represent only what could not rot. Imagine judging modern humanity solely by what would survive 10,000 years from now. Concrete foundations, a few monuments, scattered metal fragments, ruins stripped of context. Would future beings conclude that we understood genetics, astronomy, or quantum physics? Or would they see us as builders of strange stone shapes obsessed with grids and towers? Interpretation depends on perspective. Now apply this to the distant past. If an earlier intelligence encoded knowledge in ways we do not recognize, through landscape modification, ecological engineering, or symbolic architecture, its achievements may lie outside our categories. We might be standing on evidence without knowing it. Now let us turn to something even more subtle: silence. In many fields of science, silence is treated as absence. If no evidence exists, the assumption is that nothing occurred. This is practical, but not always accurate, especially in deep time. Geological processes erase information relentlessly. Entire continents are recycled through tectonic activity. Oceanic crust rarely survives more than a few 100 million years. What we call ancient is often what survived by chance. This means that the deeper we look into time, the more incomplete the record becomes. Now ask yourself this: if intelligence arose 1 million years ago, how much evidence would remain? If it arose 5 million years ago, 10 million. At some point, even stone would be gone. This is not speculation. It is geology. The Earth is not an archive. It is a furnace. Now consider how quickly our own record could disappear. Languages die within generations. Data formats become unreadable within decades. Digital storage degrades. Even books decay. Without active preservation, our knowledge would fragment rapidly. If catastrophe forced humanity into small, scattered populations, the loss would be exponential. This is not pessimism, it is realism. Now let us return to myth one final time, but with a new lens. Rather than asking whether myths describe literal events, ask what kind of memory they preserve. Myths do not preserve detail, they preserve structure. They preserve sequences: rise, harmony, transgression, collapse, renewal. They preserve relationships: humans and nature, sky and earth, knowledge and loss. They preserve warnings. In many traditions, catastrophe is not random. It follows arrogance, imbalance, or forgetting. The world ends not because it must, but because something went wrong. This moral framing may seem symbolic, but it encodes an important truth. Civilizations that ignore environmental limits do not last. Civilizations that misunderstand cycles suffer. Civilizations that assume permanence invite collapse. These lessons do not require modern science to be understood. They require experience. Now imagine that such experience was learned the hard way. Imagine a civilization that witnessed the consequences of ignoring long-term cycles, that saw the sea reclaim cities, that watched climate shift beyond control, that learned too late that intelligence does not exempt one from nature. Such a civilization might try to warn the future. But how? Not through fragile records, not through technologies dependent on continuity, but through symbols, stories, monuments. Messages designed to endure confusion. Messages that say, this has happened before. We may already be surrounded by such messages, but we read them as art or ritual or coincidence, because our framework does not include warning from the past. Now let us confront the most unsettling possibility yet. What if the question, were humans the first advanced species, is itself too narrow? What if intelligence on Earth did not follow a single lineage? What if it emerged in different forms at different times, responding to different conditions? Some may have left no trace, some may have left subtle trace, some may have left us. This does not require extraterrestrial intervention. It requires only time and complexity. Evolution experiments endlessly. Intelligence may be a convergent outcome rather than a singular event. And extinction is not selective. It erases the brilliant and the banal alike. Now turn your attention to the present. We are, by many measures, the most technologically capable species Earth has known. We alter the atmosphere, we reshape ecosystems, we peer into the fabric of reality itself, and yet we are not immune. Climate instability, resource depletion, technological dependency, global fragility. These are not hypothetical threats, they are lived realities. We are, perhaps unknowingly, reenacting an ancient pattern. This realization reframes the past not as mystery, but as precedent. If intelligence has failed before, then survival is not guaranteed by cleverness alone. It requires restraint, foresight, memory, and memory is fragile, which brings us back to the beginning. Perhaps the reason the idea of earlier advanced species feels uncomfortable is not because it is implausible, but because it feels familiar. It echoes fears we already carry, the fear that progress is reversible. The fear that knowledge can be lost, the fear that the earth will continue without us. In this sense, the question of past intelligence is inseparable from the question of future survival. They are two sides of the same thought. When we look at what has endured, a subtle pattern begins to emerge, not everywhere, not always, but often enough to demand attention. Certain places were chosen, certain forms were repeated. Certain messages were embedded not in language but in structure. These are not the marks of randomness. They are the marks of intention. If earlier intelligences existed, human or otherwise, and if they understood the instability of the world they lived on, then the question becomes not whether they left something behind, but how they chose to do it. What survives catastrophe is not complexity. What survives is simplicity reinforced by purpose. Stone survives, geometry survives, location survives, everything else is negotiable. This may explain why so many ancient structures appear excessive by practical standards. Massive stones for small enclosures, elaborate alignments for simple spaces, monuments far larger than required for shelter, storage, or defense. If function alone guided their design, they would be inefficient, but if endurance guided them, they are elegant. A structure built to resist time must do more than stand. It must communicate without words. It must attract attention from those who do not yet understand it. It must invite reuse, reinterpretation, and preservation. In other words, it must become sacred. Sacredness is not an accident. It is a strategy. Once a place is sacred, people protect it, they repair it, they build around it rather than dismantle it. Even when its original purpose is lost, its importance remains. Sacredness is a shield against forgetting. This realization reframes many ancient sites. They may not have been temples in the modern sense. They may not have been centers of worship. They may have been anchors designed to persist through cultural collapse by embedding themselves into human psychology. Fear, awe, reverence, these emotions preserve more reliably than records. Now consider the choice of alignment. Why align structures with the sky? Because the sky outlasts everything else. Rivers change course, mountains erode, forests migrate. But the stars, while not fixed, move predictably across human timescales. The sun rises, the moon cycles, solstices return. If you want to transmit knowledge across millennia, anchor it to the sky. A monument aligned with a celestial event becomes self-verifying. Anyone in any era can observe whether it still works. No language is required. No translation is necessary. It either aligns or it does not. This is not decorative. It is instructional. Now imagine you are an intelligence facing collapse. You know your world is ending or at least transforming beyond recognition. You cannot save everything. You cannot warn everyone directly. But you can leave markers, reference points that say, time matters, cycles matter, pay attention. These markers would not say we were here. They would say, remember this. Now think carefully about what kind of knowledge would be most important to preserve. Not how to build machines, not how to extract resources. Not how to dominate, but how to understand change, climate, seasons, celestial cycles, geological rhythms, knowledge that allows survival after collapse. This may explain why so many ancient structures seem obsessed with time, with repetition, with recurrence, with alignment. They are not celebrating the present. They are negotiating with the future. Now let us address a quiet misconception. When people imagine an advanced past civilization, they often imagine skyscrapers, vehicles, and sprawling cities. They imagine something that looks like us, just earlier, but this is projection. An intelligence that learned the cost of excess may choose restraint. It may avoid expansion. It may limit its footprint intentionally. Advanced does not mean expansive. Advanced may mean careful. Such a civilization would not cover the planet in concrete. It would choose specific nodes, places of geological, astronomical, or environmental significance, and mark them. These nodes would form a network, not of power but of memory. And such a network would not announce itself as a network. It would reveal itself only to those who notice patterns. Now consider how long it takes for patterns to be recognized. Generations. Patterns are invisible to individuals. They emerge only when many data points are compared. This requires not just curiosity, but patience and humility. And patience is rare, especially in cultures that value speed, innovation, and novelty. Now imagine that the message left behind was not intended to be decoded quickly. Imagine it was intended to be rediscovered slowly when the conditions were right, when the next civilization reached a certain level of observation, when it began asking the right questions. Perhaps that time is now, or perhaps it is still far ahead. Now let us confront the most difficult idea yet. If earlier intelligences existed, and if they left behind markers rather than records, then some of those markers may be misinterpreted not as remnants of intelligence, but as natural features. Terraces mistaken for erosion, straight edges dismissed as coincidence, symmetry attributed to geology. Nature is capable of astonishing order, but intention leaves subtle signatures, repetition, consistency, context. The challenge is that recognizing intention requires a willingness to accept that it might exist. And this brings us back to framework. If we assume intelligence is recent, we will interpret evidence accordingly. If we assume intelligence is rare, we will explain anomalies away. But if we allow for the possibility, just the possibility, that intelligence may have arisen earlier, then interpretation shifts. Questions become permissible. Curiosity expands. Now consider the implications of being wrong. If we assume no earlier intelligence existed and we are wrong, then we lose nothing immediately. We simply misunderstand our past. But if we assume we are the first and behave accordingly, we risk repeating mistakes that have already been made. Hubris is not just arrogance, it is ignorance of precedent. If others came before us and failed, then understanding how and why they failed becomes the most valuable knowledge we could acquire. Not to romanticize them, not to imitate them, but to learn. Now turn your attention inward again. Why does this subject captivate so many people? It is not just mystery. It is not just rebellion against orthodoxy. It is recognition. On some level, humanity senses that it is standing on borrowed ground, that our confidence is new, fragile, and untested by deep time. We look at ancient stone and feel something difficult to name, not envy, not superiority, but continuity. As if we are not the beginning of the story, but a continuation. This feeling is not irrational, it is ancestral. It arises from the awareness that Earth has hosted countless experiments in life, and intelligence may simply be one of them. There is a certain irony hidden in the way we search for intelligence. We assume it announces itself. We assume it expands, multiplies, dominates. We assume it reshapes the world so visibly that its presence becomes undeniable. Cities, machines, noise, permanence. But these assumptions come from our own moment in time, from an intelligence still proving itself, still measuring success by growth rather than balance. What if that definition is temporary? What if true advancement is not marked by expansion but by restraint? If earlier intelligences existed, and if they endured long enough to witness the consequences of excess, they may have arrived at conclusions very different from ours. They may have learned that survival over deep time requires invisibility rather than spectacle. This possibility is deeply unsettling because it reframes disappearance not as failure but as success. To explore this idea, we must loosen our grip on what we think intelligence looks like. Modern humanity treats nature as something to be managed, optimized, and extracted from. Progress is measured by control. The more we bend the environment to our needs, the more advanced we believe ourselves to be. But control invites resistance. Every system pushed too far pushes back. Climate responds, ecosystems collapse, resources decline. An intelligence that survives long enough will eventually encounter these limits, and when it does, it faces a choice: escalate control or adapt behavior. Escalation leads to complexity, fragility, and eventual collapse. Adaptation leads to simplicity, resilience, and continuity. The archaeological record overwhelmingly preserves the former. Fragile systems leave ruins, collapsing systems leave debris. Complex systems break loudly. Resilient systems leave almost nothing. This is the great bias of history. We remember failure because it leaves scars. Success leaves silence. Now imagine an intelligence that recognized this early. An intelligence that learned not to dominate Earth, but to blend into it. One that shaped its culture around cycles rather than accumulation. One that limited its population, footprint, and ambition intentionally. Such an intelligence might thrive for tens or hundreds of thousands of years and leave behind almost no evidence we would recognize. Its tools would biodegrade, its dwellings would return to soil. Its knowledge would live in practice, not artifacts. From our perspective, it would look like absence, but absence can be deceptive. Now consider another uncomfortable idea. What if intelligence does not always move forward? What if it oscillates between phases of visibility and invisibility? There may be periods when intelligence expands, experiments, and externalizes itself, building, marking, recording. And there may be periods when it retreats inward, simplifying, stabilizing, dissolving into the background of the biosphere. If so, then what we call civilization may be a temporary phase rather than a permanent state. A flare, bright, brief, and costly. In this light, earlier intelligences may not have vanished suddenly. They may have chosen to contract, not everywhere, not all at once, but gradually, a reduction of scale, a return to local systems, a fading of monumental ambition. Over generations, memory of expansion would become myth. Stories of a time when the world was shaped differently. When beings possessed greater knowledge, when the boundary between humans and nature felt thinner, these stories would not describe gods, they would describe ancestors. Now think about how modern humans respond to the idea of limits. We resist it, we deny it, we innovate around it. Limits feel like obstacles to be overcome, not realities to be respected. But deep time does not reward defiance, it rewards balance. This may be why Earth repeatedly erases civilizations that overshoot their ecological boundaries. not out of malice but inevitability. If this pattern has played out before, then earlier intelligences may have learned a lesson we are still struggling to accept. That survival is not about doing more, it is about knowing when to stop. Now return to the ancient structures that do remain. If earlier intelligences left markers, they would not celebrate dominance. They would emphasize humility, cycles, time, alignment with forces larger than any species. Stone calendars, astronomical markers, monuments that say nothing about power but everything about rhythm. Seen this way, ancient stonework becomes less mysterious. It is not the product of forgotten machinery. It is the product of a forgotten mindset, a mindset that valued continuity over conquest. Now consider the implications for our future. If we are not the first advanced intelligence, then the future is not uncharted territory. It is a path that has been walked before, perhaps many times, and each time the outcome may have depended not on intelligence itself, but on how that intelligence defined success. Did it seek growth without limit, or did it seek equilibrium? The past may contain answers not because it was more knowledgeable, but because it was forced to learn. Now let us address the quiet fear underlying all of this. If earlier intelligences chose invisibility, then our search for them may be fundamentally flawed. May never find clear proof. No cities, no machines, no unmistakable artifacts, only hints, only questions, only the unsettling sense that we are not alone in history. This frustrates modern thinking, which demands evidence that is concrete and measurable. But deep time does not offer certainty. It offers probability. And probability suggests that intelligence emerging only once in 4 billion years is unlikely. Now reflect on how this changes the meaning of the question itself. Were humans the first advanced species? May be less important than what kind of advanced species do we want to be? If advancement leads inevitably to collapse, then repeating that path is not progress. If advancement can lead to balance, then perhaps true intelligence is quieter than we expect. This reframes ancient silence not as absence, but as restraint. Perhaps those who came before us did not fail to leave a mark. Perhaps they succeeded in learning when not to. As we prepare to move into the next part of this journey, we will confront a final tension, the conflict between certainty and wisdom, between knowing and understanding, between proof and insight. For now, let this thought rest with you. The greatest achievement of intelligence may not be what it builds, but what it chooses not to build. There comes a moment in every long inquiry when the search for answers gives way to a deeper unease. It is the moment when certainty begins to feel less valuable than understanding. Up to now, we have asked whether intelligence could have existed before us, whether it left traces, whether those traces were erased, misread, or intentionally subtle. We have explored collapse, memory, myth, restraint, and silence. But beneath all of these themes lies a more fundamental tension, one that shapes not only how we view the past, but how we imagine the future. That tension is between proof and wisdom. Modern civilization is built on proof, measurement, replication, demonstration. If something cannot be verified, it is set aside. This approach has given us extraordinary power. It has also narrowed our vision. Wisdom, by contrast, does not always announce itself with certainty. It often appears as pattern, warning, intuition, or restraint. Wisdom does not always survive intact. It survives partially, distorted, and incomplete. If earlier intelligences existed, they may have left behind wisdom rather than proof, and wisdom is harder to recognize. Let us consider why proof is so important to us. Proof allows closure, it allows confidence, it allows authority. Once something is proven, it can be cataloged, taught, and controlled. It becomes safe, but the deep past is not safe. It resists closure. It undermines authority. It refuses to behave like a solved problem. And so, when faced with ambiguity, we tend to choose the explanation that restores comfort, even if it limits curiosity. This is not a failure of science, it is a feature of human psychology. Now imagine how earlier intelligences might have thought about knowledge. If they lived through collapse, if they watched certainty fail, then they may have learned that rigid knowledge is brittle, that systems dependent on precision alone do not survive disruption. They may have favored adaptability over accuracy, resilience over efficiency, understanding over certainty. Such values would not leave behind technical manuals. They would leave behind lessons, lessons encoded in form rather than formula, cycles rather than dates, relationships rather than rules, warnings rather than instructions. This kind of knowledge is frustrating to modern minds. It cannot be proven easily. It cannot be optimized. It cannot be monetized, but it endures. Now let us examine the role of uncertainty itself. Uncertainty is often treated as a weakness, as something to be eliminated. But in complex systems, uncertainty is information. It signals the limits of prediction. It reminds us that not all variables are controllable. A civilization that ignores uncertainty eventually collides with it. A civilization that respects uncertainty builds margins. It plans for failure. It avoids extremes. This may explain why ancient traditions often emphasize balance, moderation, harmony. Respect for forces beyond control. These are not primitive ideas. They are survival strategies. Now consider how our civilization responds to warnings. We collect data, we model outcomes, we debate probabilities, but we also delay, we negotiate, we hope innovation will outrun consequence. Earlier intelligences may have tried this as well, and perhaps they learned at great cost that some limits cannot be engineered away. This is where the idea of precedent becomes crucial. If intelligence has faced collapse before, then the past is not merely interesting. It is instructional, but instruction does not always come in the form we expect. Imagine standing in front of an ancient monument with no inscription, no explanation, no context. You see alignment, scale, precision, but no message. From one perspective, this is meaningless. From another, it is deliberate. It forces observation rather than obedience. It invites interpretation rather than instruction. It refuses to dictate behavior but encourages awareness. This is a very different philosophy of knowledge transmission. Not do this, but notice this. Not believe us, but pay attention. Now consider the possibility that earlier intelligences deliberately avoided leaving explicit records. Why would they do this? Because explicit records can be misused, technology can be weaponized, knowledge can be exploited, power can be centralized, instructions can be followed blindly. But patterns require interpretation. They demand engagement. They filter audiences naturally. Only those who observe, question, and reflect will notice them. This is not elitism, it is caution. An intelligence that survived collapse may have learned that giving too much knowledge too easily is dangerous. That wisdom must be earned, rediscovered, and contextualized by each generation. In this sense, the past may not be withholding answers. It may be testing us. Now let us turn to a deeply uncomfortable realization. If earlier intelligences existed and if they failed or chose to withdraw, then we are not standing at the beginning of a story. We are standing in the middle. This challenges the narrative of destiny. It reframes our technological moment not as culmination but as trial, and trials are not guaranteed success. This realization produces anxiety but also opportunity. If others came before us, then we can learn without repeating every mistake. If others failed, then survival is not impossible, but it is conditional. It depends on choices. Now consider how history might look from far in the future. Imagine a distant intelligence examining the remnants of our civilization. They find scattered ruins, plastic traces in sediment, altered climate markers, extinction signatures. They debate whether we were advanced. Some argue yes, pointing to our reach, our complexity, our speed. Others argue no, pointing to our instability, our short-term thinking, our ecological disruption. Without our stories, without our intentions, how would they judge us? By outcomes, and outcomes are shaped by restraint as much as capability. This is the lens through which we must view the past, not asking whether earlier intelligences were powerful, but whether they endured. Now let us reflect on endurance itself. Endurance is not dramatic. It does not leave monuments easily. It does not generate headlines. It does not attract myth. Endurance is quiet. It blends in. It adapts. It waits. If an intelligence learned to endure, it may have chosen to dissolve into the background of Earth's systems rather than stand apart from them. From our perspective, this would look like disappearance. But disappearance may be the wrong word. Integration may be more accurate. This idea unsettles us because it challenges the belief that progress must always be visible. But nature is full of invisible success stories, species that survive unchanged for millions of years, ecosystems that regulate themselves without instruction, systems that thrive precisely because they do not draw attention. Perhaps intelligence at its most mature becomes unremarkable. Now consider what this implies for the question we began with. Were humans the first advanced species? Perhaps the question cannot be answered definitively, not because it is meaningless, but because the evidence required may no longer exist in recognizable form. But this does not render the question useless. On the contrary, it sharpens it. It forces us to examine what we mean by advanced. It forces us to confront the possibility that intelligence is not measured by how loudly it speaks, but by how long it listens. As we approach the next part of this exploration, we will turn from speculation back toward responsibility. If the past is ambiguous, the future is not. Our choices are unfolding now. Whether or not earlier intelligences existed, the conditions that challenge intelligence are real. Climate instability, resource limits, technological fragility, social fragmentation. These are not mysteries of deep time. They are present realities. The value of this inquiry, then, is not to rewrite history, but to reframe our trajectory. If others came before us and failed, then we can fail. If others came before us and learned restraint, then we can learn it too. The past does not demand belief, it demands attention. There comes a moment when contemplating deep time where certainty quietly dissolves, not because the questions are unanswerable, but because the answers refuse to take solid form. They remain just out of reach, suggestive, incomplete, and resistant to finality. This is where wisdom often lives, not in conclusions, but in sustained attention. If earlier intelligences existed, and if their traces are faint by design or by erosion, then the absence of proof is not an ending. It is an invitation to think differently about knowledge itself. Modern culture prizes clarity. We seek definitive timelines, clear origins, unambiguous classifications. We want beginnings and endings. First causes, final answers, but the earth does not operate this way. The earth works through overlap, through cycles layered atop cycles, through processes that begin long before we notice them and continue long after we stop paying attention. In such a system, intelligence may not have a single origin. It may emerge wherever conditions allow and fade whenever conditions change. This makes intelligence less like a miracle and more like a phase of matter, a phase of energy, a phase of organization. When conditions align, intelligence appears. When they do not, it disappears. This idea strips intelligence of its mythic status but grants it context. Now consider how this reframes the story of humanity. We often speak of the rise of civilization as if it were inevitable, as if once humans crossed a threshold, language, tools, agriculture, everything else followed naturally. But inevitability is hindsight. From within the present, nothing feels guaranteed. Agriculture could have failed. Cities could have collapsed permanently. Writing could have been lost. In fact, all of these things have happened locally, repeatedly throughout history. What preserved them globally was not destiny but coincidence. A narrow window of climatic stability, a period without major planetary disruption, a fragile balance that allowed complexity to accumulate. That balance still exists, but it is not permanent. Now let us return to the notion of earlier intelligences, but with a softened grip. Perhaps there was no single lost civilization, no Atlantean empire, no global culture that ruled the world before us. Perhaps there were many attempts, small, localized, transient, moments when intelligence crossed a threshold, experimented with complexity, learned quickly, and then was undone by forces beyond its control. In this view, the past is not empty. It is crowded with beginnings that did not last. This may explain why evidence is fragmented rather than monumental. Why we find sophistication without continuity. Why we see brilliance flicker and vanish. Not one failure, but many, and not all of them catastrophic. Some may have ended quietly. Now think about how this changes the emotional weight of the question. If humans were not the first advanced species, then we are not alone in history. We are participants in a long experiment, one that has been running for far longer than we realized. This can feel unsettling, but it can also feel grounding. It means that intelligence is not an anomaly. It is a response to complexity, a response to challenge, a response to opportunity. And like all responses, it has consequences. Now let us examine one final dimension of this subject, the future. Every question about the past carries an unspoken concern about what lies ahead. We do not ask whether others came before us out of idle curiosity. We ask because we sense that their fate may illuminate our own. If intelligence has arisen before and vanished, then extinction is not an abstract threat. It is precedent. This does not mean collapse is inevitable, but it does mean that survival is not automatic. The future of intelligence on Earth depends not on capability alone, but on choice. Choice about scale, choice about restraint, choice about memory. Memory is the most fragile of these. We live in an age of information abundance, yet collective memory is remarkably short. News cycles erase context. Data overwhelms understanding. We know more than ever, but remember less with each passing year. If earlier intelligences existed, one of their failures may have been memory itself. The inability to transmit lessons across collapse. The inability to warn successors in a way that could be understood. This may be the greatest challenge intelligence faces, not how to innovate, but how to remember. Now imagine a future civilization studying us. They find remnants. Ruins, fragments of data recovered from decaying media. Stories reconstructed from partial archives. They argue about our intelligence, our priorities, our values. Some say we were brilliant, others say we were reckless. Most say we disappeared suddenly. They may never know the truth, and neither may we know the truth about those who came before us. This symmetry is humbling. It suggests that knowledge is always incomplete, that certainty is an illusion sustained by proximity. Now let us return one final time to the ancient stones. They do not argue, they do not explain, they do not insist, they simply exist. Perhaps this is the most honest form of communication across time, not a message but a presence, not an answer but a prompt, something that says, pay attention. The stones do not tell us who built them, they do not tell us why, but they tell us that someone cared enough to make something last. In a world defined by impermanence, that alone is remarkable. Now consider what we are leaving behind. Our world is fast, disposable, ephemeral. Much of what defines us will vanish quickly once maintenance stops. We are not building for deep time. We are building for now. This does not make us inferior, but it does make us vulnerable. Perhaps the most advanced question we can ask is not whether we are the first, but whether we are listening to the earth, listening to the past. Listening to the quiet patterns beneath the noise. If earlier intelligences existed, they may not have left us answers, but they may have left us perspective, and perspective is enough. As we bring this part to a close, hold this thought gently. The question of who came before us may never be settled, but the question of what comes after us is being answered right now, with every choice we make, with every limit we ignore or respect, with every lesson we choose to remember or forget. History does not need to repeat itself, but it will unless intelligence learns to hear its own echoes. We have traveled far together, across stone and sea, across memory and myth, across questions that refuse easy answers. And now we arrive at the end of this journey not with certainty but with clarity of a different kind, because the question that began this exploration was never meant to be solved like a puzzle. Were humans the first advanced species? It was meant to change how we look at time, at intelligence, at ourselves. If there is one truth that emerges from everything we have examined, it is this: Earth does not reward permanence. It rewards adaptation, it rewards balance, and above all, it rewards humility. Civilizations rise not because they are destined to, but because conditions allow them to. And they fall not because they are evil or foolish, but because conditions change faster than they can adapt. This has happened to species. It has happened to ecosystems. It has happened to cultures. There is no reason to believe intelligence is exempt. If others came before us, whether human, pre-human, or something that no longer fits our categories, they were shaped by the same forces that shape us now. Climate, geography, time, uncertainty. They would have faced the same fundamental dilemma. How much is enough? And that question may determine not just success, but survival. When we look at the ancient world, we are struck by what remains. Stone aligned with the sky, monuments built not for speed, but for endurance. Knowledge encoded in cycles rather than commands, but what should strike us even more is what does not remain. No global scars, no planet-wide devastation that clearly marks an industrial past, no unmistakable signal that says, we were here and we consumed everything. This absence may be the most important clue of all. It suggests that if advanced intelligences existed before us, they either never reached a level of planetary exploitation, or they learned at some point to step back, to simplify, to reduce, to dissolve their footprint rather than expand it. And if that is true, then our modern definition of advancement may be dangerously incomplete. We measure progress by output, by growth, by speed, by scale, but deep time measures progress differently. It asks only one question: did you last? Not for centuries, not for millennia, but long enough to matter. From that perspective, many of our greatest achievements appear fragile. Our cities depend on constant input. Our technologies rely on rare resources. Our systems assume stability in a world that has never been stable. This does not mean we are doomed, but it does mean we are being tested. Perhaps every intelligent species reaches this point, the moment when it realizes that intelligence alone is not enough. That cleverness must be tempered by restraint. That knowledge without wisdom accelerates collapse rather than prevents it. If others stood here before us, they may have faced the same realization. Some may have failed, some may have adapted, and some may have chosen a path we have not yet considered, a quieter path, a smaller path, a path that leaves little behind. This does not make them lesser, it may make them wiser. Now consider what it means to stand at the edge of this understanding. We are the first civilization capable of looking back across deep time with scientific clarity. We can see ice ages, extinctions, climate cycles, and planetary limits. We know the Earth is not infinite. We know that stability is temporary. And yet we continue as if this moment will last forever. This is the true gift of asking whether others came before us. It forces us to imagine ourselves as temporary, and in doing so, it gives us a chance to choose differently. Perhaps the ancient stones were not meant to glorify the past, but to humble the future. Perhaps the alignments were not achievements, but reminders. Perhaps the myths were not fantasies, but warnings softened by time. Not warnings of gods, warnings of consequence. If intelligence is rare, then it is precious. If intelligence is fragile, then it must be protected, not just from external threats, but from itself. And if intelligence has failed before, then survival is not guaranteed by brilliance alone. It is earned through balance. As we end this journey, there is one final thought worth carrying forward. Whether or not humans were the first advanced species may never be proven conclusively. The Earth may never give up that secret. The evidence may always remain ambiguous, fragmented, and incomplete. But ambiguity is not emptiness. It is an invitation to think more carefully, to act more responsibly, to imagine a future that does not require erasing the past. Perhaps one day, long after our cities have faded and our names are forgotten, someone or something will look back at what we left behind. And perhaps the question they will ask will echo ours. Did they understand what they were part of, or did they mistake dominance for wisdom? That question is not about the past, it is about now, and it is still unanswered. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, thank you for giving your time to ideas that do not rush, that do not shout, and that do not pretend to be certain. If you found this exploration meaningful, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future journeys into Earth's deep past, forgotten histories, and the questions that shape who we are. I would also love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and share your thoughts. Do you believe intelligence has risen before, or do you think humanity truly stands alone in Earth's history? Wherever you are in the world and whenever you are listening, thank you for being part of this moment. Until next time, remember, the Earth is older than memory, history is deeper than certainty, and the most important questions are the ones that slow us down.